Welcome to the Check Your Privilege Co-Conspired conversation. I'm Maisha T, and these conversations are held with co-conspirators to see how they're working to keep their privilege in check to be co-conspirators for Black and Indigenous people of color. Today I have with me Jennifer Kinney of the Speaking of Racism podcast. Jennifer, thank you for being here, and why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am so excited to be here. This is really cool. A little bit about myself. I am a 42-year-old white woman who grew up in predominantly white spaces all of my life. I fancied myself an anti-racist for decades, having no clue that I was the exact opposite of that. I lived abroad in China for a combination of about 6 years and worked heavily in anti-human trafficking. And then a few years ago, really started getting activated into internal work and anti-racism work within myself, and then onto a larger sort of platform, in a sense, with the podcast that I'm doing now.
That's awesome. What inspired the podcast?
Well, that's interesting, because if you would have asked me a year ago if I would ever have podcasted, I would have said there's no way on the planet. But long story short, a friend had asked me to do a podcast with her potentially, and I was kind of like, yeah, sure, okay. I have no idea what this entails. Didn't listen to podcasts. And then a friend of mine said, you should probably do your own podcast. And I thought, well, what am I going to talk about, right? And over a series of about 6 months, I had been invited as kind of a white person into a discussion space where I was asked to kind of step in and speak to some more of the difficult white people in that social media space. And through that process, I just got to know some really interesting people and tell my story. And then one thing led to another, and I was inspired to start a podcast. And that started as She's Speaking. And it was literally me in a closet, crouched down. And I have a dog and I have twin children who I homeschool. And I'm just like trying to record into a microphone, total garbage at first, but I'm like, I'm just going to talk and I'm just going to put my voice out there. And then in my wildest dreams, I thought the best avenue and the best way to do this would be to have conversations with friends. And a lot of my friends of color, there was no way I wanted to ask them, hey, do you want to come on and talk about racism on my podcast? Because within those relationships, like, we didn't necessarily talk about that, right? But there were a lot of activists that I was connecting with on social media platforms. And for as much as people poo-poo these platforms, I think they can be amazing. And so I've met just some amazing people in the last 6 to 8 months and been so privileged in having them willing to come on and talk to me about these things. Because, here's me, a white woman, trying to take these amazing conversations that I'm having in daily life, boil it down to 10 minutes and do a little podcast on it. And now I'm able to have conversations with friends about anything that they want to talk about. And I have friends who I can contact and say, hey, we want to talk about this Jussie Smollett thing.
Yeah.
10 minutes later, we're sitting down with a coffee and we're talking about it. And so that is kind of the long story short on how that started.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thanks, Jennifer. I'm going to make sure that after this, we share the links so that people can know how to follow you and get involved with your work.
Awesome.
That's great. Let's get into these questions. Do you mind?
Yeah.
They're fun. So
All
let's
right.
start with white privilege. For those of you who don't know what white privilege is, you can Google it. Just kidding. Real quick, I explained it. This inherent set of privileges you were born with based on the color of your skin. You did not ask for it, but unfortunately, the mother who gave birth to you was white, and you came out with white privilege.
Mm-hmm.
So Jennifer, do you understand your advantages of your privilege?
Yes.
And then why do you feel called to your work, to your journey? Why do you feel this call to anti-racism work?
That is an interesting question. I feel called to this work. You know, sometimes I think it's hard to explain when you really feel passionate about something.
Yeah.
I was often asked, why are you drawn to anti-trafficking, for example? And
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't necessarily explain it, but it was just something that captured my heart and my passion. And that's what I stepped out in. But I think um, if I'm really digging into this and asking that question and thinking about like why I might be drawn to this more, I was raised to identify with my Indigenous roots as a young woman. And I didn't even realize the connection until more recently as I've been processing through and kind of dealing with the pain of growing up in that identity and yet being surrounded by this world that basically tokenized and turned Indigenous people into cartoon characters and, you know, told false stories and so on. And so I think there's probably part of that also impacts me. But by and large, I feel like any injustice that I see, that I feel like I can do something to make a change in,
Mm-hmm.
I am drawn to, if that makes
That
sense.
makes sense. So any social justice issue that you know that you can make a difference in, you would kind of step up to the plate and take it.
I try, but I do feel uniquely called in this, and I don't want to get super spiritual, but I definitely feel like there were things put in my path that called me into this place where I felt like I could use my communication and my voice in communication, because really I've been writing up until I started podcasting. And
Yeah.
I had so many emotions and so many thoughts and so much to put out there, and it was really difficult to capture it in writing because they want you to give them, 600 word documents and this and that and the other thing. And so just this idea of conversing with people and communicating on this topic feels right at this point.
Yeah. Awesome. Um, yeah, I'm not going to get spiritual either. In terms of feminism, would you identify as a feminist?
That's kind of a tricky one because I have had a love-hate relationship with this term, right? And for the longest time, the word feminist just had such a negative attachment to it. And
Right.
I decided years ago that I was just going to take it back. And I'm going to call myself a feminist, and I'm going to use the term feminist, even if I don't fully identify. And it's so hard when you have such a large movement, right? Because it's never going to fully represent any one person.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a lot of things I saw that were very maybe catty and nitpicky and othering within the movement. But I just thought, you know what? I'm going to take the word and I'm going to make it because this is important. And so I identify as a feminist in a sense.
Okay. Now, in the movement, have you noticed this silencing of Black and Indigenous women of color in this feminist movement, no matter how it's changed, how it's progressed, whether we put this label intersectional feminist? Have you still noticed like the silencing of our voices?
Oh, hugely. And this is something that I'm in a place of trying to figure out, like, what is it about feminists in particular, white feminists,
Mm-hmm.
who I was just in a conversation the other day. In fact, there was a conversation about the Green Book movie winning, the Oscar. And it was this really prominent, well-known radical feminist who I follow. And she tries to advocate for women of color and bring this up. So she puts this post out there, and I get on and I start talking about why this is a problem and the way that we want these feel-good sort of savior, white savior roles. And I got absolutely spanked by this one particular feminist. And it was awesome in this sense, okay? Because here I am, I'm 42, I don't know the people, I'm not an intellect in this realm. And so I say to her, because I'm trying to say, like, I don't want to make assumptions, but I say, I assume because you follow Gail that you too are a feminist, because anybody can follow people on social media and you have no idea who they are.
Right.
And she writes back to me really arrogantly, and she's like, oh yeah, actually you should Google me. And so I Google her, and she is like the woman who created the term, and it's probably poetic that I can't remember it now, but it's basically like sexual harassment. She's the woman who coined the term sexual harassment. Okay, so she's a big deal, right? And she's on there and she's trying to argue with me that we need to get over these things and we need to just, hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And she had at one point been engaged to a Black man. And I was just like, seriously? I'm 42.
Oh.
I'm 42 and she's like 70, and she's, just like, I'm not even going to talk to you anymore. But I encounter this constantly within the feminist movement. And I'm trying to figure out, why are feminists so blind? I mean, I understand why, right?
Right.
Because of white supremacy.
The colorblind racism. It's, you know what? Sometimes when I lead workshops too, Jennifer, you got to get people out of their head. People want to intellectualize this racism conversation. You have to get into your heart and get dropped into your body. And so when we're like dialoguing on social media, like people are up here. They're trying to prove like their intellectual ability to talk about anti-racism or talk about feminism. I think it's something about the headiness of people trying to prove a point or trying to be right. And that's another tool of white supremacy and the culture that white supremacy is built.
Well, and I wonder too, if there's this element of like, when people are so heavily invested in something like feminism, and they are focused on the fact that they are struggling for rights and not being able to fully actualize, if it's almost the sense of like, how dare anybody tell me I can't relate, or how dare anybody think I can't empathize. And yet when you have that married with a complete lack of knowledge in our history, cluelessness when it comes to what white supremacy is and how absolutely woven into our foundation it is, then you get that whole like clutching of pearls, because it's like, how dare you call me racist? Do you follow Andre Henry at all? You would really like him. He is in your area as well. And he had posted something about white women in particular supporting the KKK, and white women being a problem, just as much of a problem within racism as anybody else. And there were these feminists who got on and just said, no, this isn't true. And so I feel like we're maybe entering this space where it's time to start breaking down this wall in a sense.
Yeah. Breaking down the wall. Like how, now in breaking down this wall, here's my next question. Do you think that it's up for white feminists to help white feminists break down the wall? And or can womanists, Black womanists or Black feminists also help white women to break down the wall?
And that's something I think you and I have kind of chatted about online that I really struggle with knowing the answer to. And what I tend to try to do, because I'm a white woman, is defer to women of color on this and say, like, what are you comfortable with? What do you want to do? The thing that I struggle with right now that I see is I see a lot of very like woke, I would say progressives in particular, white progressives, who they have the knowledge about racism and they're really good about resharing posts and they're really good about speaking out against racism in certain realms, but they're dead silent on a lot of other areas. And part of that, I think, is they feel like they shouldn't have a voice and that the voices should be strictly people of color. And I think that comes from a good place. Like, I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to honor people. But then at the same time, what does that do for the unsafe spaces that women of color don't want to go into and don't feel the energy to go into? So like, how do we build these partnerships and coalitions in a sense where white women get off their butts and move from ally to co-conspirator, right? And start getting in the trenches, but at the same time then know how to step back and shut their mouths when it's time to do that. And that's what I'm trying to figure out. How do we do this?
I don't know how we do it either. I know what I've come across often is this narrative that white women should only call in white women or do the work with white in their affinity group. And to me, that's also, it's necessary. And I think there's also room and necessary education, like you were saying, from Black women in this work. Yeah. But I do believe that there's a solidarity, like there's an inroads to solidarity when we do the work together. But it's really teaching white women that when it's time to do the work, step back and let white, Black, Indigenous women of color step forward.
Yeah.
Let's take the lead. And you're right. There is like this, I don't know what it is. White women can't do it.
Yeah.
And then there's like the shame spiral that they fall into when they realize they tried to do it and it failed. And that's why it's so important to don't worry about getting it wrong. Just keep doing it.
I loved that. When you posted that, was it the beginning of this week?
Yeah, I think it was Monday.
You were saying you are going to make mistakes. You are going to, falter. And I just think that's so humanizing and so healthy and important to be aware of, right?
Yeah. I don't know where we get the idea of that we have to have it. Well, white supremacy culture, perfectionism.
Yeah.
Thinking we have to be perfect and have to have it one way. We don't even live linear lives. Like our lives don't even go one way. So why would we expect it to be this way in anti-racism work?
Yeah. I would really like a blueprint, right? I mean, it's like, if I'm honest, like I need a blueprint and I need it to be across the board. I know better, but wouldn't that be lovely? And I think we all approach it that way. But I think too, in this Google everything, everybody's an expert on all things all the time, and perfectionism, I would love to see us get back to a place where we can say, I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think? Versus like, I've got to be the expert and put it out there and look a certain way.
Yeah, no, I'm a hot mess mom.
Right? Me too. My kids are upstairs in bed watching Pokemon because I homeschool them. This is my life.
This is life.
Right?
Well, this kind of leads me on to my next point, Jennifer. I want to kind of talk about this idea of throwaway culture. It's the idea that in America, if we don't like something, we just throw something away. Kind of like rooted in patriarchy, how when a woman goes and tells a man how she feels, he like demeans her. And it's like, that's not your real experience. Like, whatever, I can replace you, that narrative. And so how can we break the cycle as Black and white women of throwing each other away? Like, what are some suggestions you would have?
That is a good question. And I love that people are talking about this phenomenon, because I didn't even know what it was called. And I heard Michael Eric Dyson talking about it and ranting about it a few months ago. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. I love this so much. To hear people fighting for imperfect, fallen human beings and saying, wait a second, there is dignity and humanity to be found in this rubble. And I think that's what it is. It's like, you have to believe that people are worth it. You have to believe that there is value inherent in each and every individual. And you have to be willing to do some hard work. Yeah. And that is hard. So as far as tangibility, like something tangible, I don't know. Like, what does that look like? I think that could look like making sure you put yourself silently, white people here, into spaces that challenge the heck out of you, that make you feel uncomfortable, and stick with it. Listen, observe, don't inject yourself, don't interject your opinions, just be present, right? And then just like one of the things that makes me kind of sad is, in our culture today, we value, wellness and well-being and health. And I think all of those things are amazing. And I'm horrible at taking care of myself. And I'm really working to learn how to do that. But I see within that movement a tendency to say, if you're not successful, if you're not this, if you're not that, and then just throw people out like that. Or not if you're not, but if somebody isn't, surround yourself only with the people you want to be like. It's this whole, like, if you want to be a winner, surround yourself with winners. And I'm always like screaming inside going, no, like this isn't humanity. No. This is some made up, I don't even know what, but it sounds hellish to me too, because
man-made utopian novel.
Right? I mean, I get, like, have good influences around you, surround yourself with positive people. I understand and appreciate that. Mm-hmm. But let's not throw human beings away, because at the same time, there's this huge movement to try to shed light on the fact that so many people struggle with depression. And there are these suicides, and people are saying, in one breath, we hate you and ostracize you because you don't agree with us. And then in the other breath, they're saying, hey, if you feel lonely or alone or afraid, I can put on a cup of coffee anytime and you're welcome into my home.
Right.
So maybe it starts with, even now that we're on this public platform the way that we are with social media, maybe it is, how do we portray ourselves in social media as well? How can we speak truth while also speaking humanity, being gentle with people, being kind, being loving and open, and also saying, but the buck stops here. You start this anti-Semitic or Islamophobic or racist stuff, and I'm going to take you to task, right?
Absolutely. That's it. And I think that's for Black women, if you're watching. I am so into using mindfulness approaches to this work, because it's like a 3-prong approach, right? Like, everyone is suffering, that's our common humanity. You can take mindful moments away from hard conversations. And there's one more that I just lost. But the idea of that common humanity, it's like you can recognize, like, okay, this white person has lost their mind right now. I need to call them in and not throw them away. So I recognize that they're my mirror right now, because I do it too, right? And taking ownership in that and identifying everyone as a mirror, seeing their common humanity and calling them in to do what's right. But that's just my opinion, and I'm not the expert.
That is so good, though. And it reminds me, recently somebody posted something saying, if you say anything racist, Islamophobic, etc. on my page, I will unfriend you.
Yeah.
And I'm like screaming on the other side of the screen, thinking like, no, don't do it. We already live in such bubbles. Mm-hmm. Stick with it. Stay there. Private message them. Have a conversation from a place of love. Don't shame them. Don't ostracize them and make a public spectacle so that you can feel good about yourself. Yeah. But really go and invest in people. Because what else are we going to end up with? We're going to end up with
more of the same.
Yeah.
And the divisiveness of this whole critical race conversation.
Right.
And for me, and if you are a Black woman and you have white friends that are, I don't use the term woke because that's just ridiculous.
That's why I said that. What's the other word? What should we use?
Co-conspirators.
Okay.
I don't know if you noticed, but sometimes people come in my comments, and if I'm not comfortable, I'll say, oh, hey, I see this is bringing up something for you. And I'll tag one of my co-conspirators that I know that's doing the work to call them in. Yeah. And they'll like kind of talk the person through or go in the DMs, and then the person will come apologize. And that's what this is about, right? Like, I can't do this by myself, and I don't want to give all my energetic labor into it, but it's the calling in for support that can help kind of build this solidarity, so we're not throwing each other away.
That is beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But before we end throwing each other away, I want to ask you one thing. I don't know if you follow Catrice M. Jackson.
Mm-mm.
Okay. Well, she has this phrase called weapons of whiteness or white women violence. Catrice says it's the energetic, emotional, and the emotional responses that white women give you when you speak your truth as a Black woman. So for example, let me think of a good example. If I go to a white woman and I may just set a boundary and that white woman can't take my boundary, she'll just assert her power over me as a white woman. Like, oh no, you can't have that boundary. And then begins to gaslight me as a Black woman because I set a boundary, right? Yeah. Does that make sense to you? So kind of using her whiteness as a weapon against me.
Yeah. What kind of example, like, do you have an example? Because I am a little slow on this.
Yeah, that's okay. Do you know what gaslighting is?
Yes.
Okay. It's just basically gaslighting Black women when they speak their truth.
Yeah.
So an example, I had a experience with a white woman. I set a boundary. I said, no, I don't want to talk about something. And she persistently tried to engage in conversation with me. Mm-hmm. And then when I didn't engage the way she thought I should, then the name calling began. And we're going to stop I'm going to stop right there. But that's an kind of example of all I said was not right now. And then she persisted to kind of continue to talk to me. And then when I did not want to engage, then she started calling me names. So,
wow.
Yeah. That's like emotional abuse.
Yeah.
So that's a really extreme example. But I want to ask you, do you know if you've used your whiteness as a weapon against women of color?
I've thought about this because I had prepped for this and listened to some of your previous interviews, and I can't think of anything, but that doesn't mean I don't have anything. And I don't want to be one of those people who's like, oh, I've got it figured out by any means. And I don't know if it's just because I hadn't been given the opportunity to.
Yeah.
Because really when I came into when I moved into the city that I live in and really started building relationships and growing close with other women of color, I had done a lot of internal work up to that point. Mm-hmm. And so it's possible I just wasn't let loose before that, so I can't think of anything.
Okay. If so happened that you may in the future do that, would you be willing to offer a repair of the relationship?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Good to know.
I'm all for, I am really open to, here are my flaws. Mm-hmm. I'm not clutching pearls. I definitely have stuff, right now I'm going through Me and White Supremacy, the workbook from Layla Saad. And kind of digging in deep. And I know that there has to be stuff that there has to be stuff that is in there, right? And I'm more interested in figuring out where is it and when will I find it.
Yeah.
And hoping to uncover that, hoping to be open and vulnerable enough that I can do that, because I think if I go through this and I don't think of anything or have anything, I actually did think of something that's different, not necessarily weaponizing, but where I sort of triangulated and I felt really convicted about it when I was reading her workbook. So I was like, okay, I do have something, I am being vulnerable. I'm not being just, this person who's pretending to be open and not really being open.
Thank you. I was going to ask you while you sip some tea. Speaking of your work, where are you is your work finished?
No, it's never going to be finished.
Yeah. Okay. And then what are you currently doing to just keep unpacking your relationship with power, privilege, and racism?
Yeah. So with the podcast, I committed to, and really it's a way of keeping myself accountable, because did I mention I have twins that I homeschool?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I am doing this 12 books in 12 months aimed at dismantling white supremacy. And so I had this book that I read, and I'm really digging into history now. And I was telling my husband, I sat him down 2 days ago and I said, I am learning on a whole new level now. I said, I felt like I had the scales removed from my eyes like years ago. And I feel like there's just a whole new realization that has opened in my mind, because I started learning about and learning the history of the early colonies and the creation of race in law, in 1681, the anti-miscegenation law, but also learning about this early colonial living that happened prior to these anti-miscegenation laws. Like, everybody kind of thinks like the first people came in on a ship. They were kidnapped and brought on a ship in 1619.
Yeah.
I'm literally thinking of Spike Lee's sweatshirt right now. I'm not joking. That's how historically solid I am. No, anyway.
Remember, so it's okay.
Right. So anyway, when they came in, and some people actually worked and bought their freedom, and you had all of these free men of African descent who were starting businesses, marrying women of many different ethnic backgrounds. And then these, this life was happening. And of the 99% who were all living together, working together, there was actually no real sign of racial animosity at all. People were having babies together. They were getting married together. They were doing life together, all of that. And then you have these British elite who come in and they start creating these laws. And so learning about this, and I knew race was a social construct. Yeah. I knew the basic history, but to really sit with that and go, oh my gosh. So when I started realizing that, and that started getting stripped away, I was made aware of how much I wondered in my mind, if this makes any sense to you. I wondered, am I overreacting about white supremacy? Like, is white supremacy really this thing that I believe that it is? I didn't even realize I had these doubts until they got stripped away. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, it's like I didn't really fully understand it. And so every book that I read, every conversation that I have, every new thing that I learn just chips away and chips away and chips away. Yeah. And the fact is, I'm 42 years old. I have been built. I have been indoctrinated. I have been given messages all of my life. Yeah. Right? Yep. So, the power of that is tremendous. And so when you start to deconstruct that and experience that freedom, you don't even realize you had chains in certain spaces and areas. And I was like, whoa, okay, well, this just got more real for me,
Absolutely.
So I'm long-winded. I apologize.
This is really about you coming on with me, having a conversation so that white women can be better. Right? I love what you just said, though. I actually can see like the visual of like the scales just coming off your eyes, and you're just like, oh, this is it. Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, I appreciate the perspective of your work is never done. I've had conversations with white women who are like, oh, I've done that. I'm done now. I'm just going to go take action. And that's super dangerous. You just assume you're finished and then you're just going to take action. Your action is then more harmful than helpful.
Right.
So.
Oh, yes.
Oh, man, we're getting close to the last question. So, you're already a co-conspirator in my eyes. So I want to ask you, Jennifer, what advice would you give to a white woman to move from being an ally to a co-conspirator? Let me frame this a little bit better. And I believe that ally is passive. We've been using this word for years. I'm a white ally, and look at my safety pin. You can trust me. It's really like a passive way to say you support people of color. But when we talk about co-conspiratorship, we talk about, okay, I'm ready to take action. I know that I have this white privilege. I know that I'm inherently racist, but I'm doing my work. I'm stepping back and I'm ready to take some action, right? So what advice can you give a white woman to move beyond being just an ally?
So the thing that I would say to white women who want to move beyond just being an ally, like you're saying, it's doing the internal work and understanding that your internal work is never done. So being really humble and being in a position where you are willing to drop the mic, step aside, take a seat at any second, and just listening. So being in a humble posture in that way, and kind of understanding how to stay in your lane, and learning what is that and what does that look like. And then I would say the biggest impact that people can make is in day-to-day life. So having conversations with family members, not letting the racist joke slide at Thanksgiving, not letting the racist comment slide with your friend, not necessarily calling it out in that moment, but circling back around in a private and humanizing way.
Yeah.
If that's possible, to talk to somebody about something. And really within your work environment, but moving from ally to co-conspirator, I think involves a willingness and an understanding that, and I don't want to come across like really extreme, but like in light of the fact that we had this massacre in Christchurch today, and looking at what can people really do? Like I'm thinking about what can I really do to show my solidarity with my Muslim brothers and sisters here and now. I can get my butt in a car and I can go to a mosque on Friday prayer, and I can stand and I can use my body to say I'm here and I'm present. And it's about doing that as well. I think relationships are so important though, right?
Yeah.
We live in such segregated ways, so I think it can be more difficult for people. And we're all on different paths, but like my family, we moved our bodies into a place and into a neighborhood that would give us opportunities to connect more and reach out more, but being fully aware of the fact that our presence might be unsettling as well to our neighbors.
Yeah.
Which is this double-edged sword. Like I drive down the street, I've built relationships with my close neighbors, but when I drive down the street or when I interact with somebody, I want to have a sign or a shirt on that says, I am not going to call the police on you. Like, it's not going to happen, but like, it's a challenging thing. So I would say back to the easy, simple sort of steps: internal work, close relationships, friendships, have the conversations with your friends, your family members, your colleagues, and then you can go out from there and go on from there. There are loads of organizations that you can get involved with, right? And just start getting involved, but zip the lip and listen. That's my biggest advice.
Zip it. Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm so glad you did this podcast episode with me today. It was really awesome.
Thanks.
For those listeners, Jennifer, where can we find you on social media?
So I'm speaking of racism on Instagram. That's probably where I am most, because Twitter just makes my heart hurt and I can't do it. And then speaking of racism.com, and then the podcast you can find on any platform, iTunes, Spotify, etc. So that's where you can find us.
Thank you. And for those of you listening or watching us, be sure to follow Check Your Privilege on Instagram. There's also a Facebook community, Check Your Privilege. And if you're ready to get into some engaged work, you can join the Co-Conspirators Lounge. It's a $25 a month membership, but it comes with a book club, a group accountability session with me and the rest of the co-conspirators, and weekly accountability prompts. So you can learn more about that by visiting the website checkyourprivilege.co. And until next time, keep living a co-conspired life. Bye.